Well, I'd like to welcome everyone, and thank you so much for coming to join us. This session is Reporting to Medical Affairs Bureau. And my name is Michele Ellicks, and I work for the Registry of Motor Vehicles, and I see many familiar faces, so I really do appreciate you coming today. We have a really impressive panel. Our panelists today really know reporting procedures in and out. They've worked closely with medical affairs and with the Registry of Motor Vehicles, so I think you will learn a lot. What I also want to know, just a general makeup of who we have in the room, just for our panelists, so they can also think of their comments and gear it toward you. So just by a show of hands, how many providers, medical providers do we have in the room? Okay, great. Do we have law enforcement in the room? Anyone from law enforcement? Excellent, excellent. Anyone from the councils on aging or social work? Great, terrific. Okay, so we've got a good sampling of folks. So we'll get right to it. Our first panelist is Dr. Jim Ellison. And Dr. Ellison is Director of Geriatric Psychiatry at McLean Hospital. And Dr. Ellison is also an Associate Professor of Psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. Dr. Ellison will be addressing the emotional side of not driving, the loss, depression, and all the feelings that come with having to stop driving. So Jim was recently awarded the Massachusetts Psychiatric Society's 2014 Advancement of the Profession Award. So he's really a true expert in the field. So I'd like to welcome Jim Ellison first.
Thank you. It's really a privilege to be here and be part of today's conference, which I think is addressing an issue of importance to all of us in various ways. For myself, as a practicing geriatric psychiatrist, the conversation with my patients and their families about driving is one that we have very frequently. And like probably many of us here, it's also the conversation that we've had in my own family with my parents. We could all probably tell stories of this sort. Good. So this is the elephant in the room. I'm right here in the room and no one acknowledges me. For many of us, this is the conversation that we have with our parents. So I'm going to talk about a typical story of a successful driving retirement. This is Mrs. A, who came to see me because she wanted to talk about retirement from driving. She had been in very good medical health, was starting to become a little bit motorically weaker. She had some mild visual problems. Cognitively, she was pretty well intact, but had some normal processing speed and executive function problems that you would see in anybody aging to 87, which was what her age was. While driving her husband to a medical appointment, as she was parking the car, she stepped on the accelerator instead of the brake, jumped the curb, hit a pole, deployed the airbag, lacerated her face, and this was a wake-up call for her. She said, "I think it's time that I stop driving." This was a very successful retirement from driving, and she was fortunate enough to have resources to use public transportation, Uber, taxis, and various other things. Sometimes it's a nightmare. In a case of Dr. B, he was a retired surgeon, a very self-sufficient, independent man, cognitively intact, but starting to have significant problems with walking, neuropathy, on a walker for any long-distance walking. And after he totaled his car, perhaps as a result of sedation from medication that he was taking, from various other factors, sensory factors as well, there was a lot of dissension among his children. One of them helped him go and buy a new car. The others thought he should be reported to the registry. All of the children got together, talked with him, and tried to persuade him to give up driving, which he basically said he would never do. Now, you know, many older adults continue driving until they die, literally, you know. And as a physician, my goal would be to try and prevent that. With this particular man, ultimately, there was the unhappy situation where one of his children took it on herself to report to the Registry of Motor Vehicles, causing a lot of conflict with her siblings and with the parents, which ultimately was resolved. I'm going to talk about next the paradox that older drivers in many cases are actually safer drivers. But as we've heard earlier today, because they're physically frail, they are more vulnerable to injury and death, and that's why their fatalities are very high. Actually, if we take a look at fatalities per miles traveled, there are two peaks. The younger adults who may be driving recklessly without their seatbelts, with intoxication, and the older adults who are driving perhaps negligently and more vulnerable to the damage inflicted by accident. Okay, I want to focus particularly on the issue of, as we said, the conversation about ceasing driving. So I'm going to move along in my slides a little bit. There are barriers for the clinician who's assessing an older adult. Many of us physicians and other healthcare providers are reluctant to lose the trust of our patient, to aggravate them. They may not have good insight into why driving cessation is recommended. Driving is autonomy, driving is independence. And there also are barriers in the system. Formal assessment is not covered by insurance. It can be expensive. License renewal is relatively easy, even in Massachusetts, where we now have new legislation asking for in-person renewal and eye exam after 75. Still, it's relatively easy, and transportation alternatives in some communities are limited. There also is the issue of caregivers reluctant to end a person's driving career. In some cases, there's a spouse who's dependent upon the driver who's impaired. In some cases, it's just that the children are reluctant to have the conflict with their parents or the spouse is. This was a study from JAMA which looked at vision care providers. And even among these people who could determine that an older adult's visual functioning was not conducive to safe driving, still only about half or less reported or even related concerns to a primary care physician. And then there's the driver barriers, and this is really where the sense of terrible loss and grief comes into it. Drivers enjoy driving. Many of my patients in their later years derive one of their greatest satisfactions from being able to visit their children, their grandchildren, or just drive around to places that they enjoy. Many of them don't recognize, particularly with cognitive impairment, more than the motor or visual problems that also can be issues, that there's an issue with driving. Driving is self-esteem as well. People who are confined to home can get quite depressed about it. So when do you discuss it? My feeling is that, reporting to the Registry of Motor Vehicles in some cases, maybe many cases, represents a failure of easier and more appropriate ways of communicating the decision, the recommendation not to drive. Family members should get involved at a very early stage, and before there's a crisis, start to talk about driving. Even as they see their parents age and choose a healthcare proxy, make a last will, think about advanced directives, they should also bring up what kind of plans should we make also about transportation. The driving discussion is much more difficult when it follows an accident, when it occurs in an emergency. And there should be preparation, and by that, I mean the preparation also of the person who's having the discussion. This is the Safe Driver Checklist that's published on the Registry of Motor Vehicles website, and it's a good general guideline for things that should be discussed with an older driver. You can address each of these questions, Do you have difficulty seeing clearly in the dusk and dark? Many older drivers have voluntarily already limited their driving to short distances, not going on the highway, not driving in the darkness. And that's a good entree into the discussion. Do you have difficulty with directions, with following construction, detours, etc., seeing crossing signs or hearing train whistles, etc.? So you can read these on the website. As a physician, I also can make use of rating scales like the Montreal Cognitive Assessment, the Mini Mental Status Exam, or the CDR, which is the Clinical Dementia Rating Scale, which has a very mild category for cognitive impairment of 0.5. And if we see somebody with this level of mild cognitive impairment, we should talk to them about driving limitation. You plan your approach. You know what the alternatives are for public transportation, and be prepared for the resistance that always will come up when people talk about driving. One way of addressing the resistance is using the technique of motivational interviewing. Who has heard of this? I hope most of you. Yeah, and in motivational interviewing, what we're doing is avoiding setting ourselves up as a prescribing authority dictating a course of action, but rather helping a person recognize the dissonance between different things that they want. In particular, the conflict between feeling strong values about public safety and personal safety, and also wanting independence and autonomy from driving. There's the pre-contemplation stage, which is before a person has actually thought about the safety of driving. Preparation is when they're starting to gather information and think maybe this could be something to discuss. Action phase is when a person actually takes steps to reduce driving, and then maintenance is continued discussion. Maintenance is particularly challenging with the person who has cognitive impairment. They may forget that they were told not to drive or that they decided not to drive. They may forget the accident they had or the on-the-road test that they took. The way that we discuss this is to avoid being a confronting person, but to help the individual weigh the pros and cons of driving versus not driving, to be empathic about the sadness that a person will feel about getting to places in a different way, not necessarily limiting their mobility as much as limiting some of the alternatives for transportation and being more dependent on others, not being able to follow as simple and autonomous a schedule of getting into the car and going someplace. Roll with the resistance means that you don't try and contradict a person's concerns and resistance, but rather recognize that that's a reasonable response. The discussions may have to occur repeatedly in order to convince somebody, especially a cognitively impaired individual, and in some cases what we've done is write on a prescription that has the doctor's name. Dr. Ellison says, do not drive. And then that serves as a point of reference that can be given to the individual to look at, or for the spouse to use to show. And we evaluate whether phasing out is a safe approach. So the elephant in the room has to be acknowledged. There are ways to acknowledge also the loss and life transition that driving retirement represents. So thank you. I think I can take one question here now, and then there'll be a panel later. Yeah. Okay. Sure. Yes. Yeah, that's the Clinical Dementia Rating Scale. And actually, if you, anybody who wants that, email me at jellison1@partners.org. I'll be happy to send it to you. But it's a very commonly used rating scale.
And while we segue to Deb Kerrigan's presentation, I just want to ask all of you a question. Jim talked about having that conversation, that difficult conversation. How do you broach it? Well, what I like to ask the students that come to my program, the older driver program at the Registry of Motor Vehicles, is, what's your plan? What have you planned for not driving? And as a society, we plan for everything in our lives. We plan for retirement. We plan for our vacations. But who in this room has a plan when they stop driving for mobility? by a show of hands, has anyone even thought about it? And we work in this. Good. So I would say maybe a quarter in this room. And we're transportation and health professionals who are very aware of this issue. And if less than half of us have a mobility plan in our lives, that really tells us that we have to start having that conversation a whole lot earlier than in our 50s, 60s, 70s. It really is a lifelong decision or decision that we need to think about. So our next panelist, and thank you very much, Dr. Ellison. Our next panelist is Debra Kerrigan, and Debbie is a senior occupational therapist and the coordinator of the Drive Safe program at Newton-Wellesley Hospital Rehab Services. So Deb's been involved with older driver safety for more than 11 years, and she's also a certified car fit event coordinator. And she's also a facilitator for the We Need to Talk. And Joe Coughlin talked about the program We Need to Talk. It's an excellent series of booklets that you can just contact the Hartford Insurance Company. They'll send you hundreds of, maybe not hundreds of copies, but they'll send you multiple copies to share with your clients, to share with your friends and family. And it really gets the conversation going on how we can help older drivers. So I'd like to introduce to you Deb Kerrigan, and thank you.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Michele. I feel really honored to have been asked to talk to you this afternoon. And usually when I'm standing here talking, I'm getting to talk about things that were already talked about this morning, about the role of occupational therapy in older driver safety and community mobility, and I get to talk about what a driving evaluation looks like. But today, I was asked to talk about something different. I was asked to share my experience with you about reporting to medical affairs. And I had to pause because it's not something that I really have ever talked about before, and it is something that does need to be talked about. So we're starting from the point that a driving evaluation has already been completed, and the determination has been made that the client cannot independently or safely operate a motor vehicle because of either visual, motor, cognitive, or other types of impairments. And they don't have the capacity to make improvements. And so now we are faced with potentially conflicting or competing obligations. In Massachusetts, healthcare providers are not legally obligated to report unsafe drivers, but ethically, we are obligated to consider the safety of the client and that of the public. Fortunately, we have many resources that can help guide us in our decision-making process. At the core of the occupational therapy profession is our code of ethics, and we also have our occupational therapy practice framework, practice guidelines for driving and community mobility for older adults. And these practice guidelines use an evidence-based perspective and key concepts from our practice framework to define the OT process within the boundaries of acceptable practice. Also, in the state of Massachusetts, we do have specific laws and policies regarding medical qualifications for driving and reporting medically at-risk drivers. And how we do that in Massachusetts will be covered by Marjorie in the next presentation. So when we have determined that somebody is not able to continue driving, we have options. We can encourage them to voluntarily surrender their license, or we can choose to report to the Medical Advisory Board. And I've talked to some of my professional colleagues, some OTs, some driving instructors, and some from other professions, and they've shared with me their philosophy, and that is that they will encourage the client to cease driving and to voluntarily surrender their license in exchange for the free non-driver ID, and will only report to medical affairs when they have reason to believe that the client will continue to drive. And I think this philosophy is well aligned with our OT practice guidelines, and if I could read them, they state, Clients should be encouraged to cease driving and receive education related to the legalities of licensure, state identification cards, transportation alternatives, and community resources. And specifically, in reference to clients with cognitive deficits and impaired insight, the guidelines also state that clients who do not willingly surrender their driver's license need to be reported to the proper authorities in the state of licensure. But I don't think that this is a hard and fast rule. Take, for example, my client, Mr. N. He was an 85-year-old male who wished to return to driving following the 8-week driving restriction after having had coronary artery bypass surgery. He was using transportation services that were provided by his assisted living facility. And he was also getting, I know, what did I do? Okay, thank you. He was also getting transportation to his medical appointments from his family. And at the time that I evaluated him, he had not been diagnosed with any cognitive impairment, but his family had been expressing concerns about his cognitive functioning. But his evaluation revealed that he clearly had cognitive deficits and impaired awareness and insight. And so if you think about what I had just said, this might seem like a case where, oh, we have to report to medical affairs because he's not going to have the insight to not drive on his own. In this particular case, I chose to have him voluntarily surrender his license because he had good family support around the process. And when I had a follow-up phone conversation with his son told me that although Mr. N hadn't yet surrendered his license, he gave up his car. So there was no way he would be returning to driving. So in some of that self-efficacy, he still felt good about himself because he possessed that card that said it was a driver's license, although he was never going to drive again. And so I think if we consider that our goal was ensuring that he was safe and that the public was safe, the goal has been met, even though he still had a driver's license. So reporting to medical affairs and encouraging clients to voluntarily surrender their licenses are two of the tools that we have available to us, and I have done both of those things. And I just want to give a little plug to our Registry of Motor Vehicles Medical Advisory Board, because in the state of Massachusetts, the common perception of the Registry of Motor Vehicles falls very much in line with the picture that we saw at the lunchtime session, right? But I haven't found that medical affairs to be like that, and I have found that the people who answer the phone are extremely helpful. And in one particular case, I had a client with Parkinson's disease and a frontotemporal dementia, and we got to the point where I had to tell him he could no longer drive, and he was really ready and willing to surrender his license. But I knew, and he knew, that once he left my clinic, that he was not going to go to the registry and surrender his license. So I dialed up, I have on speed dial medical affairs, and I spoke to Janice, and she talked to him. We put her on speakerphone, and she convinced him that he could give me his license, and I could mail it to her, and she would in turn mail him back an identification card. And when he had concerns about going a period of time without an identification, she said, that's no problem. Debbie can make copies, and you can carry that in your wallet, and that's what we did. So I think that was exactly what he needed at that time to support his driving retirement. So we know that community mobility is an occupation that is essential to personal health and well-being, and that older adults without transportation may become depressed, isolated, and dependent. And I think those exact words were spoken by somebody else today. So when a driving evaluation results in cessation of driving, it is our responsibility to assist clients and significant others with strategies that promote community mobility and ease the transition from driver to passenger. And I believe I took those words directly from our practice guidelines as well. In Massachusetts transportation services, as you've heard from many speakers, they vary greatly from town to town, and it's important to be knowledgeable about the services available in your area and how to find information about areas you are less familiar with. So just because the Drive Safe program is based in Newton, I may get people from, areas of the state that I have no knowledge about. And I think getting to know your local council on aging, involving family members and caregivers, that they become invaluable partners in supporting the community mobility plan for this client. Physicians can also be extremely helpful, and I didn't know Jim was going to say this, but sometimes just having a doctor write no driving on a prescription pad is what is needed. And sometimes I've found that I have had to write a letter myself, thanking someone for choosing to come to my program, reviewing the results of the evaluation, and really emphasizing that the recommendation is that they not drive. And the other thing with regard to easing the transition is some people are prone to depression because they have a pre-existing disorder, and some people may have a situational depression around this loss of the right to drive. And so I think it's also good to counsel people about that possibility of depression, that grief, and that sense of loss that Dr. Ellison was talking about, and to encourage them to seek the psychosocial support that they need. So I wanted to just give a couple of examples. And my first example is of Mr. G. He was a 91-year-old man who was referred for a driving evaluation when he wanted to return to driving after having had a TIA. He was living alone in a condo in a retirement community, and while he had 5 adult children, only one was living in Massachusetts, and he had heeded his doctor's advice not to drive, with the only exception being that he would get in his car and drive on the premise of his facilities. And when the results of his evaluation indicated that he should not return to driving, he vehemently disagreed with the results. So although he did not have a diagnosed dementia or cognitive impairment, he was clearly not going to follow the recommendation not to drive, and he was somebody who I felt it was in his best interest to report to medical affairs. And to contrast that with Mrs. B, she was a 94-year-old woman who was referred for a driving evaluation. She was a poor historian. She had demonstrated impaired insight and awareness during her evaluation. And to the best of my knowledge, she also had not been diagnosed nor was under consideration for a dementing disorder. She had no idea why she was referred for a driving evaluation, and nor did the friend who accompanied her. And up until a year prior to her evaluation, she was a volunteer driver for the senior center in her town, and she had no idea why they were no longer calling her to provide rides for other seniors in town. She did have one incident of getting lost, but she blamed it on her daughter, who was visiting at the time. And it became clear through the comprehensive driving evaluation process that she could no longer safely operate a motor vehicle. So in this case, I did choose to report to medical affairs because she did not have the self-awareness to refrain from driving. And with her daughter being out of state and so far away, there really wasn't anything else that was going to keep her from driving. So I have also wanted to say about her that she's a good example of how a team approach is often needed, because with her permission, I contacted her local senior center, and not only were they relieved to hear that she would no longer be driving, but they were ready, willing, and able to provide her both with emotional support and transportation services. So I've got other examples, but I'm running out of time. So I just want to conclude by saying that occupational therapists use several approaches to enable our clients to meet their goals. And when the client's goal of driving independently conflicts with safety, we find ourselves in the position of having to recommend not driving and deciding whether or not to report to medical affairs. And while we may be reluctant to report because we feel like we're taking away the person's license and independence, it's important to remember that we really aren't taking anything away, their disease is. And so when we choose to report, we are supporting their safety for people who can't do it themselves through self-awareness and self-restriction. And if we continue to identify and educate the client and caregivers about community mobility options, we can help support and enhance their performance. Thank you.
While we key up Marjorie's presentation, and thank you very much to Candace Savage, who has done an amazing job with the whole medical panel. So I just want to shout out to Candace Savage with the Mass Medical Society. They've contributed so much to this conference, and I really appreciate it. Before I introduce Marjorie to you, I also want to let you know that the forms that Debbie shared with you on her PowerPoint from the Registry of Motor Vehicles are on our website, but also we brought with us today a resource page for you. On the front side of the page talks about, could your medical condition cause a collision? And very important second side to this page is a listing of all the hospitals and rehab centers and organizations that provide driving evaluations similar to Debra Kerrigan's at Newton-Wellesley. So, and I see folks in the room, Emerson Hospital has a driving eval program. Judy Romano, I'm not sure if Judy's with us now, but I saw Judy Romano has a driving rehab program. So I want you to please take a copy. We'll leave them up front, so you have to come to the front of the room. I think it's kind of funny how everyone's in the back, but the handouts will be in the front, so come on up. Or if you don't come, I'll find you, but I want to make sure you get that important resource. So our next speaker is Miss Marjorie Weinberger, a colleague of mine, and she is legal counsel at the Registry of Motor Vehicles and also at Mass Department of Transportation. Marjorie's been in the business with MassDOT and the Registry for probably 17 years now. Yep, so Marjorie, not only is she legal counsel for MassDOT, but she also sits on the Medical Advisory Board, and she's responsible for all regulatory changes. So thank you so much, Marjorie, and I'll pass it to you.
So podiums aren't really good for me. You see talking hair, so I figure I'll be the Oprah of our speakers and move amongst you. So you like my slide? It's not my name. Steve Evans is the director of the Medical Affairs Division, and he could not be here today. I work with Steve Evans. I know Steve Evans. I am no Steve Evans. I am, however, your poor man's Steve Evans. So what I'm going to give to you is a quick overview of the role of medical affairs and some other issues that I think that you may find of interest. You interact with medical affairs on two reasons. One for disabled placards and plates, and the other is for setting policies and procedures regarding medical fitness to operate a motor vehicle and minimal qualifications to operate a motor vehicle, and that's where the Medical Advisory Board comes in. So when you interface with the Registry of Motor Vehicles on elder driving, you often do so for voluntary surrender reasons. And it's not just for elder drivers, it's for anyone who feels that they no longer should be or have fitness to operate a motor vehicle safely on the roads. And so what people can do is they can self-assess, and they come into the Registry of Motor Vehicles, they take a form from us, which they can get online, and they voluntarily surrender their license. We give them a free ID in response, but this is not permanent. It's not that you voluntarily surrendered it forever, it's that you did it that day. You can come back, you can get a competency test to prove that you're safe to operate a motor vehicle, and you can reinstate your license. And so for those who may have a temporary disability or reason why they should not be operating, this is at least an entry into doing so. In 2014, there were 3,300 people who voluntarily surrendered their license. So we've already heard pretty much every speaker say that there is no such thing as mandatory reporting in any state in the United States, except for blindness, which Michele had wanted me to make sure that I put the caveat right up there. But we do have an interesting situation that in September of 2010, under the Safe Driving Law, we enacted the ability for healthcare providers, and that's very broadly defined, and I'll tell you the definition, to be able to identify drivers and reach out to the Driver Control Division, and say, to the Medical Affairs Division, and say to them that we believe that this person is no longer fit to operate a motor vehicle, and healthcare providers can report that. Law enforcement and concerned citizens can do the same thing. So I'm just going to read this because I'll never remember it. The law defines healthcare providers as registered nurses, licensed practical nurses, physicians, physician's assistants, physical and occupational therapists, ophthalmologists, and optometrists who are licensed and healthcare providers. In 2014, there were 12,000 total matters handled by medical affairs. Of that, 75% were referrals from medical and healthcare providers. 25% of that was from law enforcement. Now, what happens with law enforcement is they'll often stop someone driving and determine that the person is not safe to operate for a myriad of reasons, including they just did not have the cognitive ability, potentially based on age, to be able to operate safely. They can send in to the Medical Affairs Division what's known as a complaint medical. And one of two things can happen. A license can be suspended immediately if someone is determined to be an immediate threat to public safety, or a person is sent 10 days notice and told that they have been found to be unsafe to drive, to come into a hearing to medical affairs and determine their fitness to operate. Now, what happens at these hearings is you are called in. It's a scheduled hearing, unlike a license suspension hearing, so we try and work very carefully with the communities. And you come in and you can produce medical documentation that you are fit to operate. And this is where it becomes kind of the war of the physicians. Can you go to the doctor who's going to certify to medical certainty that you are safe to operate a motor vehicle? Because you may have a physician who has sent us notice that you're not, but you may go to a physician who will say that you are. So a lot of doctor shopping can happen. It's not for the registry's personnel to decide which doctor is accurate. If in fact there is a fitness to operate certificate from a physician, the registry is not going to take someone's license. Moving on. So 25% or so of the hearings that happen are based on law enforcement assessments. Concerned citizens can also, shall we say, dime out their neighbor and be able to report they believe someone is unfit to operate. What's important to know when you send these things in is that they are a public record. They're not protected, and someone has a right to know when a privilege has been potentially taken from you and the basis therefore. So once you have a hearing, once you come in for your hearing, if you've been given medical clearance, then you're able to operate a motor vehicle and there's no suspension. If, however, after the hearing it's determined that to a medical certainty someone is unsafe to operate a motor vehicle, then the license will be suspended and the matter will be referred to the driver control unit who deals with all suspensions. And a hearing will be held there. And again, you can get a medical clearance at that point, and in which case the license will be reinstated. If in fact the license is not reinstated and there is a suspension of the license, you can appeal that. It's a due process right. You can appeal the suspension of your driver's license to the Board of Appeal on Motor Vehicle Liability Policies and Bonds, long name for the Board of Appeal. And it is a tribunal hearing that reviews decisions of the registrar. If at that point it is determined that the suspension will stand, then you can appeal that to the Superior Court on a record appeal on 30A. So restrictions on elder drivers. Some statistics. In Massachusetts, there are 901,000 active licensed drivers over the age of 65. That's about 18% of the active driver's license population in Massachusetts. There are 310,000 active drivers over the age of 75, and 75,000, almost 76,000 active driver's license over to the age of 85. In 2010, under the Safe Driving Law, they implemented the over 75 requirement that if you reach the age of 75 or older, in order to renew your driver's license, you have to come to the Registry of Motor Vehicles and one, either take a vision screening test there, or two, provide a vision screening certificate from a licensed optometrist ophthalmologist. That's what we say you do. So no more online, ease, don't go to the brick and mortar branch. You have to come into the Registry of Motor Vehicles and perform the test and pass it. Now what's interesting is the Governor's Highway Safety Association just this month released its study. And it reported that 33 states in the District of Columbia also had special provisions with regards to mature drivers. And it ranged from mandatory vision testing, such as we have here in Massachusetts, doctor's letters, recommended road tests. They were very broad, and encompassing ways of looking at elder restrictions. What's interesting, however, and Joe Coughlin said it earlier, is that the age ranges for age restrictions went from age 40 to age 85. So there's no consensus on what age is and what it means to be elderly. Interestingly, going in the opposite direction, there are two states, however. One, Tennessee, who said that a license after the age 65 will never expire, so you never have to go to the registry again. Or Oklahoma, which has reduced fees over the age of 60 and also a non-expiration consideration. So you may not want to drive there. So what's the Constitution say about all of this? And I'm a lawyer, so I have to do something legal, or I wouldn't have earned my penny today. And that is, the Constitution says that you need a rational basis in order to achieve a legitimate state interest. And all that really means is there a public interest on the roadways? Is that the interest of public safety paramount to our society, thus that you can impose age restrictions on drivers? And the answer is yes. But the reality is, and one legislator said it best, that laws restricting elder drivers is a vote-killing statute. So you are never going to get back into public life if you vote, in favor of these restrictions, because no one wants to give it up. We're very comfortable restricting our 16-year-olds and our junior operators, and it's easy to see why. They don't vote. So we can restrict them all we like. But once you get into older populations, they are the plethora of voters. And no one wants to vote against their own interest because the alternatives just aren't apparently available. So I had a very stirring wrap-up, and we were all going to stand and clap, and it was very exciting. But Joe Coughlin did it so much better than I could have. So I am going to wrap up with, I called my dad before I came, and I'm down in my minute, and they're going to play the music and throw me off soon. And my dad's 78 like I want to be 78. He's amazing. And he said, well, what are you doing? And I said, I'm talking about the issues regarding elder drivers. He said, well, what does it mean to be old? I said, well, I'm going to ask you. You're 78 years old. What does it mean to be old? He said, well, being old is like being drunk. You don't know it when it's happening. And I don't think I can beat that statement. But I think what happens is we're not always self-aware enough to realize when we need to come off the road. And it may not be age-related. But we're all so interested in getting to point B that we take a risk on the travel. So thank you for having me here.
Thank you so much, Marjorie. That was excellent. So I want to, first of all, point out a very important number for each and every one of you, the phone number to Steve Evans's office. It's there. Call it, and you'll also get that phone number when you pick up one of these as well. So that's your tie, that's your connection to us at the registry. We want to hear from you. So our next panelist is Dr. Jatin Dave, and let me introduce him to you. And what I also want to ask you one more question, or tell you one thing. Each and every one of us in this room has the ability to report an unsafe driver. I don't have to be in healthcare. I don't have to be a police officer. I could report Marjorie if I thought she was not a safe driver. So know that you do have the ability, even if you may not be an expert in one particular field. Each and every person in this state does have the ability to report an unsafe driver to the registry. I brought with me copies of the Medical Affairs Procedure Booklet, and that will tell you exactly how Medical Affairs handles the reports that it gets. So just wanted to throw that out to you too. So Dr. Jatin Dave is a geriatrician and a hospice and palliative care specialist. He is the medical director for geriatric at Tufts Health Plan in Watertown. And Dr. Dave is, his particular interest is improving the communication between clinicians and patients. So we have Dr. Dave as a discussant, and he'll share his comments for a few minutes, and then we'll take questions. Thank you, Dr. Dave.
So I'll keep it very brief, because I know you probably want to ask questions. So my reason and my perspective on this is coming from seeing patients over the last 10 years. I was fortunate to start my practice about 12 years ago or so. I had a very small panel which I could see because I have other roles. So I've been seeing about 250 patients over the last 10 years. Some of them have been deceased, as you can imagine, and that's where I would share some of the thoughts after providing a couple of quick comments of what you guys discussed or what I took note of. So Dr. Ellison, I think the main highlights from his really great presentation was older adults are safer, but more vulnerable drivers. So most of the people are safe, but at the same time, if they do get into an accident, if you're concerned about them, reporting them and at least thinking about reporting is important. He also mentioned about driving sedation as a likely event in one's life. So I think planning for it is critically important. Debbie then again gave a great presentation on occupational therapy perspective as well. what I liked about her presentation, which was mentioned in Dr. Ellison's presentation as well, is kind of phasing out versus complete sedation. How do you gradually wean some patients driving, which is probably more palatable to most of us. None of us like sudden change in our life. So I think if that's possible, that was really worth mentioning. Voluntary surrendering versus reporting is also, I think, something which you summarized really well. And community mobility is so important to any of us. I think that's worth highlighting. I think it's one of the essential functional skills we need to have to live independently. It doesn't mean you need to do it yourself. You can do it with some help, but you need to have that as part of your life to live independently. And then again, I appreciate you sharing. And by the way, I would echo the same thing. Steve, I had a couple of conversations with him about a couple of my patients. Great educator, great supporter, and will walk you through these issues if you have any challenges ever. The part which struck me the most is the amount of license revoked, which is about less than 1% of overall population in Massachusetts. So we have about 800,000 to 900,000 seniors overall, if you count the whole population. Some are drivers, some are not, as you heard about it. But again, if you put in context of overall population, it's a very small population. We are not talking about 10% of our seniors who are bad drivers or who cannot drive anymore. It's an extremely small population. So that's what I summarized. Quickly, what I've learned seeing these patients, you need to have 3 things to drive. And you pretty much heard that, but just I would like to sum it up this way. You need to be able to see, think, and move, which is what you heard today, all at the same time, within fraction of seconds. So that's what you may want to think about, whether you assess that through driving evaluation programs, or if they're expensive and people cannot afford it, you can be creative about this and basically get it done through insurance-covered programs as well. I do refer them to occupational therapists, do cognitive assessment myself, or refer them to someone like you, and we'll do vision testing. And then once you get this information, you could coordinate this yourself as well if you are fairly skilled doing this. So with that, I will open up to questions, which is probably, I'm curious to hear what your thoughts are. There's so much expertise in this room. So I can move with the microphone if you have any questions or whatever works for you.
What I'm looking for is this incident happened with my mother, is she went to the registry and got her license renewed. She could renew it online, except there was a parking ticket from 1989. She's 85. I'm not sure how she got through the computer system, but it was allowing her to renew online until the parking ticket came up. A sibling brought her to the registry to get her license. She's walking in a walker. She's hard of hearing. Her vision is fine, pretty much. She needed help with the vision test, though. She was reading it vertically rather than across, and the person at the registry was helping her and giving her direction on how to do the test. That was my last point of, she, in my opinion, she wanted her ID is what she wanted. If they had said to her, how would you like an ID? When you go into the registry, a lot of families believe if they've pushed and pushed and they think, okay, she's gonna go get her license renewed, the registry is not gonna allow this person to renew their license without some more medical documentation. She's not driving, which is fine, but the point is she should have not got a license renewed at the registry. She was in person. To me, just seeing her move would have said a lot of red flags. Plus, she has a little cognitive processing issue in regards to hearing and, not dementia or anything, but she's a little, takes a little while to process stuff. So the person was very kind from what my brother said. And I'm like, well, that's great, but there should have been a room to take her to and talk to her and go over the options. I just don't know what happened. And I could have believed that she got a license. So other with the medical registry people at the site, there seems to be some training needs to be involved.
I absolutely understand what you're saying, and in a perfect registry, there would be the space to be able to have the kind of counseling that you're looking for. But I'm going to give you a little background on our clerks. They don't have the kind of medical background necessary to be able to say to someone, we don't think you're safe to operate a motor vehicle. The registry employees have to leave it to families, concerned citizens, and healthcare providers to be the ones who make that call. While we shouldn't help people with vision tests, that's inappropriate. We also cannot be in the situation of assessing the person in the door and making the decision that they're unfit to operate a motor vehicle. We're not doctors there, and we don't want them to be little Inspector Clouseaus to decide that, oh, you should drive and you shouldn't. That kind of thing would be arbitrary and capricious, and it would offend people if someone was having, say, a bad day with MS, and they were assessed being unable to have mobility to operate a motor vehicle safely. So we really have to leave it to those who can report accurately.
And even as doctors, there is no perfect test by which you can say a person should or should not drive. That's a myth. If you're really looking at a doctor to figure out, can you guarantee this person could drive or not? I can't. It's similar to what we do with any treatment. It's about risk assessment. When the risk of driving outweighs the benefit of driving, that's when we ask them to stop. But it is a spectrum and not just hard yes or no part, which is the challenge. Even though there are tests out there, none of them are perfect, by the way.
So my mother loves me, and I turn her in. What happens with my name? Where's it go? Who has it? Do I have to lie to her?
This is kind of a legal issue. Everything that we do in the government is open, transparent, and available under the public records law. We would not be able to suppress someone's name or identity from being able to do that. Besides, if you're going to take a privilege like a driving license, you have a due process right to be able to know who was the person who sent the information in. So we can't suppress that information.
Yeah, and the only way that your mother would be able to get that information is she would have to put a request in writing to medical affairs to have that information released. But in Massachusetts, there is no confidentiality. There is immunity for healthcare providers, but there is no confidentiality.
Or you could use your doctor in that case. I'm happy to be the bad guy because I don't have to see her every day. And if it's the right thing to do, doctors can play a role there.
I have two quick questions. One, Marjorie, you said you get 12,000 referrals per year, and I wondered how many of those then end up having their license removed permanently? Oh, 3,000, okay.
What I was saying ineloquently before is unfortunately the registry's database is unable to calculate those kinds of queries. It doesn't have the reporting capacity now. Its database goes back to 1985 and runs on COBOL, so really you have to be antiquated to be able to use it, which is why our clerks are so good at it. So we are going to be having more modernization in the future, and the hope is that we'll be able to do better tracking in the future and reporting.
I have one other question. I'm trying to synthesize what everyone has told us, and I work at a level 1 trauma center, and so when the doctors who see a trauma patient has just been in a crash, if they don't have an ongoing relationship with this person, so should they be trying to get them into one of these assessment programs where they can assess their driving and then have them refer if they need a medical whatever, or should they be calling in themselves or sending in the medical referral?
So I think Debbie is probably the right person to respond as well, please.
It can be done either way. So oftentimes, if the person is moving on to another level of care and they're not going to be driving, they can wait to be assessed at the time when they're ready to be return to driving. Oftentimes what I've seen happen is in that recovery period, somebody applies for a handicap placard, and they do not realize that part of applying for the handicap placard is that it can result in a medical suspension of their license. But what Marjorie said is so true, that those are generally temporary suspensions. So even a person whose license is suspended for medical reasons, when it is appropriate, it can be reinstated. And often I get people in the Drive Safe program, and I've helped them to do just that.
Yeah. So from what I've seen, the role of the acute care provider's responsibility is to tell them not to drive until evaluated. So that's the key issue. Make sure they talk to the family members and tell them until they undergo evaluation either by occupational therapist, primary care doctor, whoever it is, especially after the critical event like a really big accident or stroke. And one more thing which I forgot to mention, which I think Marjorie has mentioned, is it's also important to think about reinstating the license as well. So for some of these illnesses, it's not a permanent no. I'm glad you mentioned that, because all the time we think about retirement, we don't think about people who are inappropriately retired, who should be driving, because their health does improve sometimes too. So make sure you don't forget about the other side as well, which is, and I have done this in fewer successful cases, when somebody said, no, you should not be driving. There is no deficit whatsoever. You should reassure them and let them undergo driving evaluation if you're in doubt. But we should not take away their driving capabilities from them. Other questions? Yes, the last one, and I think we're going to stop after that.
I have kind of an unusual question. We have found that insurance doesn't cover the occupational therapy. Is that typical, Deb? And how do we get around that? Because we have family members who want to come and talk to you, but then they find that their insurance isn't covering it, so that they can get their parents in that. How do you work around that?
So insurance does not cover the driving evaluation programs. They do cover occupational therapy, just to correct it, sorry. They don't cover driving evaluation program per se, which is a challenge. Driving evaluation program includes vision testing, occupational therapy testing, cognitive testing, all three in some combination. Yeah.
Lena, you are correct that in Massachusetts, that the driving evaluation programs are fee-for-service programs. And you are correct in saying that occupational therapy services are covered services by insurance, but these fee-for-service programs are not. And I think, Aylin, you said it earlier in your presentation, there's work to be done with regard to policy. And in the meantime, and the example that Aylin gave was that if your parent was driving a car and was told that they needed a $500 brake job, would you tell them, oh, that's too much money, go ahead and drive? So if somebody's driving is potentially broken, it's well worth the investment to get the comprehensive evaluation and either ensure that they are okay to drive or help them with that transition to not driving if they're not. Yeah.
So the way I get around this barrier, so the cost, and correct me if I'm saying anything wrong, in my working with the different driving evaluation program, is anywhere between $300 to $500, depending on which program you're looking at. Is that fair range for your program, or am I outside of your range? Yeah, 2 to 500 range. And as I mentioned earlier, if you have a really creative physician who could do vision testing, which is covered by insurance, occupational therapy testing, and cognitive testing yourself, and connect all these dots, which requires some thinking, but most people are willing to do it if that's possible. Anyway, I think we will stop here, unless, okay? Thank you for your participation. Thanks for being here.